In Greek, there are two words for time. The first word is chronos time, like chronological time. It's the clock time. The other word is kairos. And kairos is more like the artist's time, the flowing time. It also means in right timing, and that everything has its own timing or right timing, and it's not by clock time. It's more the rhythms of life and the rhythms of time. And I find that very reassuring. I find there's a momentum in the world right now that's very connected to faster is smarter and bigger is better, and there's not enough time, that time is running out, that there's an urgency to time, and there's fear around it. And when I think about kairos time, I think about the sense of getting lost in time, and that time is actually holding us in a generative way. And I've been introduced to a momentum of timing that's quite surprised me, because I've quite associated myself as a kind of a creator, someone who helps get things going, who can lead in kind of exciting ways. But the momentum that I've been introduced to is the extraordinary quality of time and of life in the cycle of dying. And this is something called the panarchy loop. And again, a Greek word. Pan means all or one, or the god Pan was the god of the wild. And archy, like hierarchy and panarchy, archy means structure in Greek. And so this is a beautiful way of looking at, there's a structure or an architecture to the wild or to the wholeness. And this is actually a kind of snazzy model that we often use in social innovation, but it comes out of ecological systems. But if you look at the green over here, reorganization, that could be like the new seeds of an idea or the new seeds of growth. And then we try and grow things. We try and grow our organizations and ideas. We give them roots or new structures so that we can really build a future for that organization or that innovation. And the idea often is to create a kind of a project or an initiative or an institution that has systemic impact, that has a large-scale impact. So for example, a government or a healthcare system, or a large NGO like the World Wildlife Federation. Those have kind of a systemic impact. But the one that I've been spending time in, quite surprisingly, is this back loop here, this S loop underneath, which it says release, but it's also creative destruction or letting go, or you could call it dying. And I find this also very reassuring, that there are cycles, there are natural cycles that we go through, and we have hard times or when things collapse. There's always a movement out of it at some point. And this is a very natural way also of looking at timing. There's a right timing for everything. So I was invited in 2008 to be the executive publisher of a really interesting magazine called Ascent Magazine. And it's a Canadian magazine, really pioneering in yoga, social change, and art. And at 9 years old, they were asking a very important question. They were asking the question, what does it mean to be sustainable? Truly, at 9 years old in the publishing industry, they were really wondering what's next. And so I came in thinking, we'll really get things going. There'll be this bright future. And we discerned in the first 8 months that actually to be sustainable is to know when and how to die. When to know how to let go of the form that you're currently in, to release that energy and find the new form eventually. My first reaction was, oh no, I failed. I thought I could do something quite different, but actually it was giving me and the whole team there an opportunity to practice something absolutely essential, which is to know how to lead in different times of the life cycle, not just in the growth stage, not just to get things going up, but to see that in the back loop, there's actually a huge amount of life and knowledge and wisdom that can be gleaned. So what we did is we created, well, first we were working ourselves out of a job, which created a bit of anxiety. But so we created a practice called conscious closure, which would be an organizational practice, a business practice, but also a yoga practice of closing a magazine. And I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute. After we closed the magazine in 2009, I closed 20 years of my own life in Montreal. And I actually learned a lot from the collective process of closing about my own need to close things in my life and to start new chapters. And I was invited to Jerusalem, of all places, not a place that I'd ever thought I would ever go to, because I fell in love with somebody. So there's no better reason to move across the world but for love, but love in a conflict zone. And I went there at a time, 2009, 2010, when the Arab Spring opened opened up all across that part of the world and into Europe, where I don't know if you recall, but all the protests in Europe in the squares. And there was a huge amount of protest, of revolution, of collapsing of old forms. So the form of governance, the form of economics, the form of maybe non-citizen participation in how we lead our countries. And citizens were standing up and saying, no, we need something else, and we need to take a part in this. And it created a huge amount of tension and collapse and fire. And so the difference between the magazine and this was the magazine, we said, aha, I think it's time to close. Let's do that together. In Greece and all across Europe, it was more of a revolutionary impulse. So in Greece, one of the ways that we work, and also I realize we work this way with the magazine, is that when there is this time of not knowing what to do or how to do it, you have to create a minimal optimal structure. You have to create enough structure for all the chaos and all the unknowns and all the unpredictables to have a place, because those unpredictables and those unknowns have a lot of information for what could possibly come next. So we work with something called the chaotic. So just enough order and just enough chaos can create what we call a chaotic space, where actually when those things meet in an intentional way, new ideas, emergent ideas, unknowns that hadn't been visible have the chance to come through. So one of the ways we do that in Greece is by creating spaces for people to come together in their chaos, in their fear, and in their excitement about the possibilities for a new future, and to learn together. And so a 4-day gathering or a 4-day training might allow people to learn some new methodologies around participatory collaboration and things like that. But actually what we're doing is we're containing the energy and the new impulses so that they have a space to come through and to come up. And so these are some of the ways that we do this with citizens, and they self-organize, they're invited, they hear the call for, yes, I want to be part of something new, or I'm already creating something, and is anybody else doing that? And we create the space for them to meet and to create new networks and new initiatives together. So some of the practices of conscious closure, one in this, but they're both collective kind of experiences of consciously closing or being in collapsing and birthing at the same time, a very kind of difficult place to be. The first thing is reframing leadership. That leadership is stewardship, it's hosting, it's convening, that the kind of leaders who can gather people and allow each person to also be a leader is the kind of leadership we need when we're in chaos. Every voice counts. The diversity of voices really counts. The other is to name the moment for what it is. It's time to close, let's close. We're in chaos, let's name it, because it actually gives a lot of energy and focus when you know where you are in the life cycle. In the back loop, have a good question to guide you. So what does it mean to be sustainable is a really good question. Another good question is, what is the work that really needs to be done? Or how do we create new systems that serve and sustain people and the planet? Those are calling questions. Those call in people who are also asking that question. And then this idea of creating a container in the practices, the chaotic, for working with all the unknowns and allowing us to not know together. There's a beautiful skill right now, I think, in leadership of not knowing together, and to allow ourselves to be in that and to not jump to things before we've really felt and sensed the new possibilities. The other one is to invite, and to invite the community to participate. So with the magazine, we told our whole community that we were closing, and they raised $20,000 so that we could create a final issue of Ascent magazine, a 10th anniversary legacy issue, and it was absolutely beautiful. So in the final closing, there was a celebration, there was a creation of something while something else was leaving. And in Greece, I have to say, the importance of storytelling. When you really don't know what's happening, when you're really in a new time where you haven't seen it before, when you start to tell your stories, you remember who you are, and you remember what's possible as a human, as a family, as a society. So these are some of the practices of conscious closure. And the reason I'm sharing them with you is because they actually helped me understand many things when I came into a very, possibly the most intimate experience of conscious closure. And I'll just catch my breath. In 2012, I was working in Greece. My dad's here. I was working in Greece, and I came home for my parents' 50th wedding anniversary. And it was a beautiful event. 2 days later, my mom was diagnosed with cancer. And she had cancer in all of her inner organs, and she had cancer in her brain. So immediately we knew as a family that we were in a palliative situation. And palliative named the cycle. It wasn't to fight it, it wasn't to deny it. My mother absolutely embraced that this was the call, this was the cycle of life. So suddenly we were a family that was palliative. The second thing that happened is my mom immediately said, we're going to write an email. We just had a huge party with 50 of our closest friends and family. They need to know. It's 2 days later and everything has changed. And so we wrote an email to everyone. And sure enough, within minutes and days, we had all of these beautiful emails back from people witnessing my mother and the impact that she had on them in their lives. And it was the most beautiful thing. It was like plumping my mother's soul up before it was getting ready to journey in a new direction. She was being filled with the love and the life that she had experienced through other people's eyes. And it was like a living eulogy. We often say the eulogy afterwards. But when the person hears how important that they've been in the lives of others, you can't imagine, I think, the courage it allows them to build to go into a very unknown journey of dying. The second thing that happened, and this was my mother being a participatory leader. She was throwing it out there, this is what's happening, who wants to be involved and how. So one of the things that happened was that those people who received that email began to inquire into their own inner process of who have they lost in their lives, that maybe that grief has been unattended. Maybe there's a remembering or a remembrance of something in their own personal lives that my mother's invitation was opening up for them. And we have a great friend who took me aside at one point and she said, I'm remembering my mother and my mother passing away and I'm lighting a candle for her now, 20 years after her death. My kids think I'm a little bit crazy, but it's really meaningful to me. I thought, well, that was Mom. Mom created that invitation to allow people to enter into a much deeper space of their own lives. The third thing this participatory kind of invitation did was that it allowed me to contact a lot of my friends from around the world, and they began to really support me as well. And one of them from Afghanistan, whom my mother never met, but he knew all about our family, he wrote and he said, in our culture and in our faith, we say, the gates of heaven open at the feet of the parents. And it was such a beautiful, beautiful image. And I found myself often at my mother's feet. And in the moment she died, that's where I was. And I thought, Mahmoud, he really gave me something in that moment of loss. I felt like I was part of something bigger. So it's a very radical act in our culture to invite people into the process of dying. The second thing is the chaotic. Having order and meeting chaos allows for new things to emerge. So we couldn't cope with everything, with my mother's care. And we realized that we needed some help to create some more order around this very unpredictable journey of my mother's cancer. She was very clear she wanted to die at home, and so this is our home calendar. And calling in the Palliative Care Network in Toronto, and I would say they're a network of angels that had been previously invisible to me, this extraordinary network of people who do this for a living. And so we created kind of an order, a structure to her daily care, which allowed us to enter more into the emotions and into the kind of less tangible, more irrational experience of knowing that a mother is leaving, that a wife is going to be leaving. So two things happened. One was that the practical was taken care of. And then this kind of more mythological life started to emerge, this more kind of poetic, and this is what I call the wild life and dying, the opening up into these different elements of life that we don't usually have participate with us. So my mother had cancer in her brain. Her mind was working differently. She was making different connections. Every so often she would lose consciousness, but she was really still with us. But she was with us, but she was also in other places. I haven't met those places yet, but there was a sense of her being with us and also moving. So one day she said to me, Vanessa, you can't hang on to life And you can't hang on to joy. And then she quoted Yeats. She'd never quoted poetry to me before. And she said, he who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. And she was saying to me, it's a very, very deep thing. She was saying, don't hang on to me, but also in your life, know how to kiss the joy as it flies. Know how to live in eternity's sunrise. Know that there are these natural times of being in life and letting that life go. And she said it with such ease. But she was also, I think, remembering her father, who was a poet, and her mother, who was a librarian, and she grew up in a very literary household. And suddenly she was with this other world, her childhood, her ancestors. She was bringing all of that in. And the second thing was when she said to me, Vanessa, I came back with a haircut and darker hair somehow, and she said, you're my dark daughter. I said, oh, and she said, no, I had a dream about you last night. She'd never, ever told me about her dreams. And she said, we were traveling, we were in a dark place together. And I immediately thought of the myth of Persephone and Demeter, where the young maiden gets taken into the underworld, and she has to taste the fruits of the underworld in order to grow up, in order to come back up as a woman. And when she comes back up as a woman, the spring comes, and every winter she goes down into the underworld. And that's our seasons, the spring and the winter, the cycling of life. But for me as a daughter, my mother saying that to me, I felt it was part of an initiation of her coming into the crowning of her life, the crone. And I was coming into this other part of my life of being a woman, having been initiated into some of the subtleties of the underworld, of this subterranean life. That's my little cousin Luke, when my mom passed away. So one of the other things is this paradox between grief and celebration. That in this back loop, the S loop, in this period of being between, things that are alive and things that are just germinating, that there's a lot of paradox between grief and celebration, between living and dying, between the sense of the body receding, but a bigger life emerging, or a sense of the bigger life. And what I mean by that is the more mythological, maybe the more archetypal, maybe these more irrational kinds of feelings. And in those paradoxes, I think, are a huge amount of wisdom. And to live in those paradoxes is really important. And so one of the things that I witnessed that was a paradox was seeing my parents completing their marriage contract. And they'd been married for 50 years. And I saw them understanding what it means to say, till death do us part, that our contract in this form is complete, but there will be another form. And there's a paradox in that. It's like life ends, but all of the essences of the life that's been lived, it doesn't end. It's in everything. It's in every cell of our body. And it was the most extraordinary thing to see my parents ending their contract. But then my father recontracting with life, and he's 79, and he has entered a new stage of his life, but with all of the love and all of the tangible stuff that happens in a 50-year marriage. It's not gone, it's just in a different form now. So I think that there's a really important lesson in knowing how to be in the not knowing how to be in the darker loop, that time of letting go of what we know and being aware and present and receptive to the things that we don't know, because those are the seeds for the pathway forward. And in my work in social innovation, there's a huge focus on getting going and getting things done, but actually to pay attention to the essence of life that emerges in being very, very with the season that you're in is an extraordinary act of courage, because it's countercultural and it's radical. And yet what I've seen in the work in Greece, what I've seen in our work with the magazine, and what I've witnessed in my own family is that there is a huge amount of alchemical life that we need to pay attention to, and we need to have a relationship in order to move into that next stage of our lives, whether it's maturing as a human or maturing our global systems so that they serve people and they can sustain the planet. And I'll just end with a beautiful quote by the poet Mary Oliver. And she says, I have something like, everything must die and too soon, but tell me, what will you do with this one wild and precious life? What will you do with this one wild and precious life? And my invitation to you is to feel the wildness of your life and to allow the things that you need to let go of be wild and inform you so that you can come into the next stage, whatever it is, with a huge amount of wisdom and a sense that you're a part of an enlarged life, that your life has enlarged because you've touched on some of the less visible elements of life. Thank you.